Juan José Esparragosa Moreno. Juan José Esparragosa Moreno spent the first part of his career working for the Mexican federal government. He carried a badge, drew a salary, and reported to a security agency in Mexico City. By the end of that career, he was running cocaine for the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere, brokering peace between warring cartels and acting as godfather to the children of men who controlled half of the world's drug supply. And in June of 2014, a small Sinaloa newspaper reported that he had quietly died of a heart attack at 65. His body, it said, was cremated within hours. The ashes were carried back to Culiacan. There was no funeral the public could attend. There was no autopsy released. There was no confirmation from the Mexican government. 12 years later, the United States still has not officially closed his file. Some of the people who chased him for 30 years are not entirely sure he ever actually died. He was born in 1949 in the mountain village of Huixiopa in the Sinaloa municipality of Badiraguato. That single municipality, a stretch of poor farming villages in the Sierra Madre, would also produce El Chapo Guzman, El Mayo Zambada, and the Beltran Leyva brothers. His nickname came from his complexion. It was said his skin was so dark it appeared blue. Among the men he eventually worked alongside, he was known simply as El Azul. In the 1970s, Esparragosa did something almost none of his future associates ever did. He joined the law. The Dirección Federal de Seguridad, Mexico's federal intelligence and security agency, hired him during an era when the DFS was widely understood to be running protection for the same drug traffickers it was supposed to be hunting. Esparragosa used the badge to build a smuggling operation out of Guadalajara with two brothers named Naranjo. By the time he traded the uniform for a permanent place in the trafficking world, he had every contact a young trafficker could possibly want. He became a founding member of the Guadalajara Cartel, sitting at the same table as Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. In 1985, when DEA agent Enrique Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in Guadalajara, Esparragosa was implicated in the planning. He was arrested in March of 1986 and sentenced to 7 years and 2 months. He was back on the street by 1993. After the Guadalajara cartel fractured under federal pressure, he moved to the Juarez cartel and became second in command under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the trafficker famous for owning a private fleet of cargo jets. When Amado died on an operating table during plastic surgery in 1997, Esparragosa shifted again, this time joining the Sinaloa cartel. By the early 2000s, he was one of its 3 principal leaders alongside El Chapo Guzman and El Mayo Zambada. What made him different from the men he ran with was simple. He did not pick fights. He ended them. Insight Crime described him as the peace broker among Mexico's drug trafficking organizations. DEA assessments from the early 1990s identified him as the linchpin whose low-profile diplomacy kept the Sinaloa alliance from publicly tearing itself apart. His position was cemented through family ties most cartel bosses would have killed to build. He married El Chapo's sister-in-law. He became godfather to one of Amado Carrillo's sons and to one of El Mayo Zambada's nephews. One of his own sons married into the Beltran Leyva family. Every major branch of what was eventually called the Federation, the alliance binding Sinaloa, Juarez, and Sonora, was tied back to a man almost no one outside the trade had ever seen in a recent photograph. The United States State Department posted a $5 million reward for him. Mexico added roughly 30 million pesos on top of that. He was indicted in the Western District of Texas in 2003. He was named on Mexico's official list of the 37 most wanted drug lords in the country. None of it ever produced a credible photograph of him taken after the late 1980s. Then came June 7, 2014. The Sinaloa Weekly Rio Doce, citing anonymous police sources, reported that Esparragoza had died the previous afternoon. According to the story, he had damaged his spinal column in a car crash roughly 2 weeks earlier. He suffered a heart attack trying to climb out of bed. He was 65 years old. His body, the article said, was cremated almost immediately, and the ashes were carried back to Culiacan. Mexico's Federal Prosecutor's Office and its National Intelligence Agency opened investigations. Neither of them ever publicly confirmed the death. The man who held the Sinaloa cartel together through 3 decades and 4 major realignments may or may not have died, depending on which agency you ask. 2 months later, his son was arrested on trafficking charges. Under interrogation, he told Mexican authorities that his father was deceased. That single line, from a son who had every reason to want the search called off, remains one of the only on-the-record claims of the death. The journalist Anabel Hernandez has spent years documenting a pattern of Mexican drug lords staging their own deaths in order to retire. In Esparragoza's case, the theory never went away. His United States wanted poster reportedly remained active for years afterward. Stories circulated that he had undergone plastic surgery and quietly settled into civilian life somewhere in northern Mexico. There was no fingerprint match. There was no body. There was no grave that any journalist was ever able to photograph. The man who built an entire career out of being invisible appears to have ended it the same way. El Azul disappeared so completely that even the Mexican government cannot say for certain whether he is gone. The man up next went one step further. He died in front of federal police, came back from the dead, and was being prayed to inside Catholic shrines for 4 years before Mexico had to kill him all over again. Nazario Moreno Gonzalez. On December 12, 2010, the Mexican federal government held a press conference to announce that Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, the founder of La Familia Michoacana, had been killed in a 2-day gunfight with federal police in the town of Apatzingan. Every major news outlet in Mexico carried the story. President Felipe Calderón's office released a statement. There was just one detail that did not quite fit. The federal police never recovered the body. They said his men had carried it off the battlefield. The fact that this excuse worked at all is part of how 4 years later, the Mexican Navy would have to kill the same drug lord all over again. He was born on March 8, 1970, in the small rancheria of Guanajuatillo, in the municipality of Apatzingan, Michoacán. His family was poor. He was one of many siblings. As a teenager, he crossed into the United States, where he spent roughly a decade, much of it in California, before fleeing back to Mexico ahead of a drug trafficking prosecution. Somewhere in those years, he is believed to have become an evangelical Christian, allegedly inspired by the Christian author John Eldridge. He used several names over his career. El Chayo, the diminutive of Nazario, was the most common. He also went by El Mas Loco, the craziest one. Inside his organization, he was called El Doctor and El Dulce. Mexican investigators eventually found him operating under a fake identity built from the names of Emiliano Zapata, Morelos, and Che Guevara. He is believed to have been one of the original commanders of the Milenio Cartel. In 2004, after the capture of another trafficker named Carlos Rosales Mendoza, Moreno and a partner named José de Jesus Méndez Vargas took control of what became La Familia Michoacana. The new organization declared independence from the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas and went to war with both. La Familia announced itself to the public in 2006 when its men rolled 5 severed heads onto the dance floor of a Michoacán nightclub. What Moreno built next was unlike anything Mexico had seen before. He authored a book titled Pensamientos, meaning thoughts, that recruits were required to study. It blended evangelical Christianity, self-help language, and quotations from figures including Che Guevara. Members of La Familia were forbidden from using drugs or alcohol. The cartel publicly banned local drug sales, framing them as poisoning the people. Initiation into the organization involved prayers, 3-day fasts, and oaths sworn over a Bible stamped with the cartel's initials. Killings were described internally as divine justice. Extortion payments collected from local businesses, the cobro de piso, were treated as a religious tithe. La Familia issued sealed receipts. Then came December of 2010, and the gunfight in Apatzingan, and the press conference where the Mexican government declared him dead. Within weeks, something strange began happening in the towns Moreno had once controlled. His closest ally, a former schoolteacher named Servando Gomez, known as La Tuta, publicly mourned him. A march for peace was held in his honor. Banners read that Nazario would always live in their hearts. La Tuta and the surviving members of La Familia broke away to form a new and even more brutal organization, which they called the Knights Templar Cartel. Villagers across Michoacán built shrines to Moreno. Statues of him appeared inside small chapels, dressed in the white tunic of the Knights Templar. Reforma reported on a prayer that locals were reciting, asking the Lord Almighty for protection through Saint Nazario. And no, I'm not making that up. Some residents would later tell journalists that they had been forced to venerate him at gunpoint. There was just one problem with the new religion. Saint Nazario was not actually dead. By 2011, civilian self-defense militias, the auto defenses, had begun rising up against the Knights Templar across Michoacán. They drove the cartel out of town after town, and they put enormous pressure on the federal government to do its job. Federal forces began quietly tracking a man they had publicly declared dead 4 years earlier. On March 9, 2014, one day after his 44th birthday, Mexican Navy Marines and soldiers cornered Nazario Moreno in the village of Tumbiscatillo. He died in the resulting gunfight. This time, the government had the body. Forensic Chief Tomás Zerón presented fingerprint identification. Security spokesman Monte Alejandro Rubido told reporters that authorities were 100% certain. A self-defense leader named Hipólito Mora told Mexican press that the death was a victory and that Moreno had done enormous damage to the people of Michoacán. The Mexican government had spent 4 years describing him as deceased while he ran a cartel, expanded its territory, and was being prayed to inside Catholic chapels. And somehow, it gets worse. The original 2010 announcement of his death had given Moreno 4 years of complete freedom of movement under the protection of his own mythology. Local people, believing he was a saint, helped hide him. Federal forces, believing he was buried, were not looking for him. When the shrines finally came down, the statues went with them. Most have since been destroyed or hidden. A few are believed to still exist in remote villages, kept by people who, even after the second death, were not entirely sure what to believe. El Chayo built a drug cartel that operated like a church. The third name on this list took the opposite approach. He recruited deserters from the Mexican Army's most elite Special Forces unit and used them to build a private army that would eventually go to war with the country that trained them. Ociel Cárdenas Guillén. In November of 1999, a DEA agent named Joe Dubois and an FBI agent named Daniel Fuentes were driving through the border city of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, with a confidential informant in their vehicle. Within minutes, they were surrounded by roughly 15 armed men. The man standing at the center of them was a former auto mechanic named Oziel Cardenas Guillen, and he already controlled the Gulf Cartel. He was holding a rifle, and he kept saying the same thing in Spanish over and over. He did not care who they were. What happened in the next 60 seconds would either start a war between the United States and a Mexican cartel, or it would set in motion a manhunt that would consume the next 4 years. He was born on May 18, 1967, in Matamoros. His earliest work was as an auto mechanic. He moved into the Gulf Cartel during the chaotic period after Juan Garcia Abrego, the cartel's so-called godfather, was arrested and extradited to the United States in 1996. With the leadership vacuum came an internal war, and Cardenas survived it. In mid-1999, he ordered the murder of his friend and co-leader, Salvador Gomez Herrera, known as El Chava. The killing earned him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his career. They called him El Mata Amigos, the friend killer. Some accounts attribute the actual shooting to a man named Arturo Guzman de Chena, acting on Cardenas's orders. Either way, by the end of that year, Cardenas was the unchallenged leader of the Gulf Cartel. Then he made the decision that would change Mexican organized crime forever. Around 1997 to 1999, Cardenas approached Arturo Guzman de Chena, the same man who had reportedly carried out the Gomez killing. Guzman de Chena was a lieutenant in the Mexican army. Cardenas asked him a simple question. He wanted the best men possible. Over 30 deserters from the Mexican Army's special forces, including soldiers from the elite Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, accepted Cardenas's salary, which dwarfed anything the military was paying. They became the cartel's enforcement arm. The original founders included a soldier named Heriberto Lascano. They took their name from the radio call sign of their commanding officer. They became known as Los Zetas. A former DEA official named Leo Silva later described the arrival of Los Zetas as the beginning of a new era of organized crime in Mexico, one defined by industrial-scale fear. Insight Crime put it more directly. The Zetas, the organization wrote, ushered in an arms race and levels of brutality never before seen in the country. The standoff in Matamoros in November of 1999 fits inside this period. Cardenas had spent 2 years building a paramilitary unit, and now 2 American federal agents had been spotted in his city with an informant. According to Dubois' later account, the agents invoked the memory of Enrique Camarena, the DEA agent killed in Guadalajara in 1985. Dubois warned Cardenas that if he killed 2 United States federal agents that afternoon, he would not care today, but he would regret it tomorrow and for the rest of his life. He told Cardenas that he was about to make 300,000 new enemies, every officer and agent in the American law enforcement system. Cardenas let them go. The United States manhunt began that week. It would take 3 more years. Cardenas was finally arrested on March 14, 2003, after a shootout with the Mexican military. He continued running the Gulf Cartel from inside prison, using handwritten notes carried out by visitors. He was extradited to the United States in January of 2007. On February 24, 2010, a Houston judge named Hilda Tegel sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was fined $100,000 and ordered to forfeit $50 million to the United States. While Cardenas served his American sentence, the army he had built turned on the Gulf Cartel. Los Zetas split off, and the 2 organizations went to war along the Texas border. For several years, the Zetas became the most violent criminal organization in Mexico. In August of 2024, after roughly 14 years in American federal prison, Cardenas was released from the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, and turned over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. On December 16, 2024, he was driven to the Tijuana border crossing, handed to Mexican authorities, flown to Mexico City, and booked into the Altiplano maximum security prison the same day. The American ICE official who handled the transfer, Samuel Olson, told reporters that the removal of one of the country's most notorious international fugitives underscored an unwavering commitment to public safety and justice. 2 days later, Cardenas pleaded not guilty in a Mexican court. By December 23rd, a judge had issued formal imprisonment orders against him for aggravated homicide and organized crime. Mexico's federal prosecutor's office held 3 pending arrest warrants against him and reactivated 7 cases that had been suspended for years. The Mexican Security Cabinet issued a joint statement noting that, between the pending cases and the new charges, Cardenas could theoretically face a sentence of up to 730 years. That figure is a legal maximum, not a handed-down sentence. As of the most recent reporting, he remains in pretrial detention at Altiplano. The man who once held 2 American federal agents at gunpoint in a Matamoros street now sits in a Mexican prison cell, waiting for a series of trials that, between them, could outlast the next several generations of his family. Cardenas built an organization too loud to hide. Our 4th case did the opposite. He built an empire so quiet that for years almost nobody, including the DEA, had any idea how big it had become. Ignacio Nacho Coronel Villarreal. On the afternoon of July 29, 2010, roughly 150 Mexican soldiers and 2 military helicopters surrounded a safe house in Zapopan, a suburb of Guadalajara. Inside was a man so reclusive that even the United States Drug Enforcement Administration had no recent photograph of him. By the time the raid was over, 1 soldier was dead, 2 fragmentation grenades had been thrown by men inside the house, and the floor of the residence was covered in roughly $7 million in cash. The man whose body was lying on that floor had, in the previous decade, quietly built Mexico's industrial methamphetamine industry. His name was Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, and there are still journalists who do not believe the corpse was actually him. He was born on February 1, 1954. Sources differ on the exact location, with most placing his birthplace in the town of Canelas, Durango. He began his trafficking career in the 1980s, working under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the same Juarez cartel boss who would eventually employ El Azul. Coronel ran operations out of the state of Nayarit, on the Pacific coast. When Amado Carrillo died on an operating table in 1997, the 3 men just below him, Coronel, Esparragosa, and El Mayo Zambada, broke away from what was left of the Juarez organization and joined what became the Sinaloa Cartel. After El Chapo Guzman escaped from Mexico's Puente Grande prison in 2001, Sinaloa entered the most aggressive expansion of its history. Coronel was one of 3 principal leaders, alongside El Chapo and El Mayo. The Pacific Corridor, the states of Jalisco, Colima, Nayarit, and part of Michoacán, became his territory. His specialty was crystal methamphetamine. He earned the nickname El Rey del Cristal, the King of Crystal, for almost single-handedly building Mexican meth production into a continent-spanning industry. He pioneered the use of massive clandestine superlabs in remote parts of Mexico, capable of producing meth at industrial scale. At the same time, he moved cocaine in multi-ton shipments from Colombia, using fishing vessels along the Pacific coast, before transferring product overland into Texas and Arizona. United States investigators traced his influence into Europe, Central America, and South America. In one operation alone, codenamed Operation Baja Kings, The State Department's seizure of roughly 80 pounds of crystal ice at 90% purity stood for years as one of the largest single American meth seizures on record. He was sanctioned under the United States Kingpin Act on June 1, 2005. The American bounty on his head reached $5 million, and almost no civilian in Mexico could pick him out of a lineup. A Mexican brigadier general named Edgar Luis Villegas later described Coronel's operational discipline in plain terms. According to Villegas, Coronel had not associated with anyone other than a trusted lieutenant in order to maintain a low profile. That sentence from the senior officer who oversaw the raid that killed him captures something the DEA had been struggling to convey for years. Coronel ran one of the largest meth and cocaine pipelines on the planet, and the photographs in the American case file were a decade out of date. On the afternoon of July 29, 2010, that profile finally caught up with him. When the Mexican army arrived at the safe house in Zapopan, Coronel did not surrender. He killed one soldier and wounded another with a combination of small arms fire and grenades before being shot dead. The Los Angeles Times reported, citing Mexico's Federal Attorney General's office, that soldiers found jewelry, luxury watches, firearms, 2 hand grenades, 3 vehicles, and roughly $7 million in United States currency inside the residence. They also recovered his laptop and arrested the lieutenant he had been hiding with. The DEA called his death a crippling blow to Sinaloa cartel operations. His niece, a young woman named Emma Coronel Aispuro, was married to El Chapo. The marriage tied his family directly to the Sinaloa leadership, and his death created a power vacuum at the top of Mexican meth production that took the cartel years to fully fill. Within days of the raid, his nephew and alleged successor, Mario Carrasco Coronel, known as El Gallo, was killed in Guadalajara. Then came the dispute. In her 2013 book Narcoland, the investigative journalist Anabel Hernandez alleged that the man killed in the Zapopan raid was not Coronel at all. According to Hernandez's reporting, fingerprint records of the body matched a man named Dagoberto Rodriguez. The corpse's estimated biological age, she wrote, was somewhere between 40 and 45 years. Coronel, on the day of the raid, was 56. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The Mexican government has continued to maintain that Coronel was killed in Zapopan on July 29, 2010. The investigative claim remains a minority position that contradicts the official version of events. Whether the body in the photographs was Coronel or somebody else, the operational reality is the same. The figure once called the King of Crystal stopped running cartel meth labs after July of 2010. The Pacific Corridor was redistributed within the Sinaloa leadership, and the 20-year hunt for one of the quietest drug lords in the Western Hemisphere came, at least on paper, to an end. If you're enjoying this video and you haven't subscribed yet, this is the time to do it. Subscribe so the second half of this story lands in your feed when it goes up. Hector Luis Palma Salazar. In 1978, Hector Luis Palma Salazar was sitting in an Arizona prison serving 8 years for drug trafficking. 2,500 miles away in Mexico, his business partner, a Venezuelan trafficker named Rafael Clavel, was carrying out the most thorough act of personal destruction in modern cartel history. By the time Palma was released, his wife had been beheaded and her remains delivered to him in a box. His 2 children, both under the age of 6, were dead. And Palma had spent every spare moment of his sentence planning what he would do to every person responsible. He spent the next several decades doing exactly that. He was born on April 29, 1960, in the village of Noria de Abajo, in the Sinaloa municipality of Mocorito. He had light skin and blue eyes, which is where the nickname El Güero, meaning blondie, came from. He began his criminal career as a car thief in Sinaloa, then graduated to working as a gunman for Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the boss of the Guadalajara Cartel. By the time that organization fractured in the late 1980s, Palma had risen to the level of a co-leader. He helped found what would eventually become the Sinaloa Cartel alongside Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. The story that defined him, the one that journalists still write about decades later, began with a betrayal that was never really his. Palma had partnered with a Venezuelan trafficker named Rafael Enrique Clavel Moreno. Clavel had at one time been the boyfriend of Palma's sister. The business relationship appeared to be working until Palma was arrested in 1978 and sentenced to 8 years in an Arizona prison for drug trafficking. According to multiple accounts, including reporting by the BBC, the Arellano Felix brothers and Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo had quietly approached Clavel and offered him money to destroy Palma from the inside. What Clavel did next is part of why the unwritten rules about cartel families exist in the first place. He seduced Palma's wife, Guadalupe Leja Serrano, and convinced her to leave Palma and flee with their 2 children. He forced her to withdraw $7 million from accounts under her name. After that, he killed her, beheaded her, and shipped her head to Palma in a box. He took the 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 4, into Venezuela. Neither child survived. Mexican and Venezuelan investigators have publicly described the killings of all 3 as a deliberate act of revenge orchestrated against Palma while he sat in an American prison cell. When Palma was released from American custody, he set out to find every person involved. Mexican law enforcement estimates he killed roughly 14 people he held responsible, including relatives and close associates of Felix Gallardo. Clavel himself was eventually murdered inside a Venezuelan prison, allegedly on Palma's orders. For decades afterward, journalists in Sinaloa described the Palma revenge campaign as the moment Mexican cartel violence stopped pretending that families were off-limits. The unwritten rule, the one that had protected the wives, parents, and children of the men in the trade, was broken on Palma's watch. It never came back. His own capture happened almost by accident. On June 23, 1995, Palma was on his way to a wedding aboard a 12-seat Learjet when the aircraft crash-landed near the border between Jalisco and Nayarit. He survived. Mexican federal authorities arrested him within days. The remarkable detail of the arrest was not the crash. It was the escort. Palma was traveling with a security detail composed largely of active officers of the Federal Judicial Police, Mexico's federal investigative agency. Palma himself was wearing a full PJF uniform with identification on his person. Over 24 federal officers were arrested with him. The arrest exposed in a single afternoon how thoroughly the Mexican federal police had been bought. He spent the next 12 years in Mexico's Puente Grande prison. He was extradited to the United States in 2007, where he pleaded guilty to cocaine trafficking. He served 9 years of a 16-year federal sentence at a penitentiary in Atwater, California, and was deported back to Mexico in June of 2016. The deportation lasted exactly as long as it took Mexican prosecutors to walk him across the border. He was rearrested at the crossing on charges relating to the 1995 killing of 2 Nayarit police officers and transferred to the Altiplano maximum security prison near Mexico City. What happened next is the part nobody who follows Mexican criminal cases quite understands. In May of 2021, a Mexican court acquitted Palma of organized crime charges and ordered his immediate release. He was rearrested within seconds after federal prosecutors produced a new murder warrant. In May of 2023, A judge named Maria Dolores Olarte ruled that the organized crime evidence against him was, in her words, mostly unfounded, and ordered his release for a second time. Again, federal prosecutors obtained a fresh homicide warrant, this one tied to the killing of Juan Pablo de Tavira, a former deputy director of the Puente Grande prison. And no, I'm not making that up. 2 different judges, 2 different acquittals, and Palma never spent a single uninterrupted hour as a free man. In March of 2024, a 3rd judge ordered the homicide trial reinstated. As of the most recent reporting, Palma remains incarcerated at the Altiplano. He has been continuously in custody since June of 1995, more than 30 years. In late 2019, his niece, Maria Jimena Palma Romero, and his sister-in-law, Cynthia Mercedes Romero Verdugo, were abducted in Sonora and later found dead. The cartel war he helped start 3 decades earlier was still finding new ways to take pieces of his family. Palma's story is what happened when one man's grief consumed every cartel he ever touched. Our 6th subject inherited the most profitable trafficking empire in Mexico from a brother nicknamed the Lord of the Skies, and proceeded to turn the cartel's home city into the most violent place on the planet. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. Between 2008 and 2012, a single Mexican city recorded more than 10,000 homicides. National Geographic reported that the peak year, 2010, saw 3,766 killings in that one city alone. For a brief stretch of years, Ciudad Juárez, just across the river from El Paso, Texas, was the deadliest city on the planet. The war that produced those numbers had 2 sides. One was the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo Guzman. The other was the Juárez cartel under a man named Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. He had inherited the empire from his older brother, the one journalists had called the Lord of the Skies. He spent the next decade fighting a war he never quite won, and the bodies piled up in numbers almost no one in Mexico had ever counted before. He was born on October 16, 1962, in the small Sinaloa community of Guamuchilito, in the municipality of Navolato. He was one of 8 siblings. His uncle was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, the original Guadalajara cartel founder. His older brother, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, ran the Juárez cartel and earned the nickname El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies, for owning a private fleet of cargo jets that he used to move cocaine. Vicente grew up inside the family business. He used the aliases El Viceroy and El General. Through the 1990s, he helped his brothers Amado, Rodolfo, and Alberto expand the Juárez organization into the most profitable trafficking cartel in Mexico. When Amado died on an operating table in July of 1997, during a botched plastic surgery, Vicente inherited what was then the largest cocaine pipeline on the continent. For a few years, the inheritance worked. The Juárez cartel transported hundreds of tons of cocaine sourced from Colombia's North Valley cartel, with downstream connections to the FARC and the AUC through northern Mexico and into the United States. Its enforcement arm was a group called La Línea, the Line, backed on the American side by a prison gang called Barrio Azteca. The cartel was also allied, for nearly a decade, with the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo Guzman. Then, in 2004, the alliance fell apart. El Chapo allegedly ordered the killing of Vicente's brother, Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes. Vicente responded by ordering the killing of one of El Chapo's brothers, who at the time was incarcerated in a Mexican prison. Both killings were carried out. What followed was the bloodiest cartel war in modern Mexican history, centered on the border city of Ciudad Juárez. Most credible counts put the death toll between 2008 and 2012 at more than 10,000. National Geographic's reporting, citing federal and state figures, recorded 3,766 homicides in Juarez in 2010 alone, a figure that had fallen to 256 by 2015. The Juarez cartel under Vicente pioneered the use of car bombs targeting Mexican police. It was the first major Mexican cartel to use the tactic, which had previously been associated with Colombian organizations during the Pablo Escobar era. In 2008, with the war going badly, Vicente allied with the Beltran Leyva organization in a combined effort against Sinaloa. The alliance lost. The Sinaloa cartel ultimately took most of the Juarez corridor. By the early 2010s, Vicente had changed his name, altered his appearance, and relocated to the city of Torreon in Coahuila. The Mexican federal government tracked him there for 11 months. He was arrested on October 9, 2014. The United States had offered $5 million for him. Mexico had offered roughly $2.2 million. After his capture, the president of Mexico's Chamber of Deputies, Silvano Aureoles Conejo, told reporters that Vicente's fall gave the population renewed confidence in the federal government's anti-crime efforts. In June of 2015, a Mexican court convicted Vicente of organized crime, drug trafficking, money laundering, and the unlawful stockpiling of firearms. He was sentenced to 28 years. He served the next decade inside the Mexican prison system. Then, on February 27, 2025, something almost no Mexican cartel boss of his generation had ever experienced occurred. He was extradited to the United States, along with 28 other senior trafficking figures, in the largest single mass transfer in the history of Mexican-American narcotics cooperation. The other extradited figures included Rafael Caro Quintero, the original Guadalajara cartel co-founder, who had been implicated in the 1985 killing of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. Vicente was arraigned the following day in a Brooklyn federal court in the Eastern District of New York. He pleaded not guilty to running a criminal enterprise. A federal judge later granted his defense a 90-day window, beginning June 24, 2025, to negotiate a possible plea deal that could spare him a life sentence. That's not a typo, by the way. A man held responsible by official Mexican government tallies for tens of thousands of deaths in Ciudad Juarez over the course of a decade has, as of early 2026, the option to reduce his sentence through cooperation. His attorney, Ruben Oliva of Miami, is currently in plea negotiations with the United States Department of Justice. Vicente Carrillo inherited an empire and lost most of it. The seventh figure on this list built his empire from scratch, ran it like a multinational corporation, and became the first drug trafficker ever placed on the FBI's most famous wanted list. Juan Garcia Abrego. On March 9, 1995, the Federal Bureau of Investigation added a Mexican drug trafficker to its 10 most wanted fugitives list for the first time in the program's history. The man's name was Juan Garcia Abrego. According to the DEA, his organization was generating an estimated $10 billion a year. Fortune magazine, by a separate estimate, put the total value of his empire at $15 billion. He had cocaine moving across the Southern American border inside the buses of the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. He had, according to court records and a personal ledger seized at his arrest, federal commanders, deputy attorneys general, and at least one FBI agent on his payroll. And 18 months after the FBI's announcement, a Houston jury convicted him on all 22 counts and sent him to prison for the rest of his natural life. He was born on September 13, 1944. His exact birthplace is disputed. Some records list him as born in the town of La Paloma in Texas, which under American law would make him a United States citizen and would later play a critical role in his criminal case. Other records list his birthplace as Matamoros, Tamaulipas, on the Mexican side of the border. He himself never publicly settled the question. He was raised inside the smuggling tradition of northern Mexico. His uncle, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra, had been one of the founding figures of the original Gulf Cartel during the Prohibition era. Guerra had run whiskey into the United States during the 1920s and had been known locally as the Al Capone of Matamoros. He took his nephew into the business in the early 1980s. By 1984, Garcia Abrego was running the cartel himself. What he did with it changed how Latin American cocaine moved. The standard arrangement at the time was that Mexican traffickers were paid per kilogram to move Colombian cocaine across the border. Garcia Abrego renegotiated. In a series of meetings with Colombia's Cali cartel, he proposed that, in exchange for guaranteeing delivery into the United States, the Mexicans take 50% of every cocaine shipment as payment. The Colombians accepted. The deal moved the Mexican cartels almost overnight from being couriers to being partners. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Garcia Abrego's organization was estimated to be moving more than 300 metric tons of cocaine into the United States every year. The DEA in 1994 believed his personal profit had reached $10 billion annually. Fortune magazine estimated his overall empire at $15 billion. To put that another way, the estimate placed his organization in roughly the same financial bracket as a publicly traded American corporation. The methods his network used would not be believed if they were not documented. Between 1986 and 1990, the cartel reportedly moved cocaine inside the buses of the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. The buses were never stopped at the border. Court testimony also described a private arrangement with certain members of the Texas National Guard to truck cocaine from South Texas to Houston. What kept the entire operation running was a bribery network that reached almost every relevant office of the Mexican federal government. A ledger seized at Garcia Abrego's arrest reportedly detailed payments of $1 million to the head of the federal judicial police, $500,000 to its operations chiefs, $100,000 to the federal commander in Matamoros, and, according to United States prosecutors, more than $1.5 million per month to a Mexican deputy attorney general. The payments were entered into the ledger under a single category. Garcia Abrego called them a tax on doing business. On the American side, an FBI agent named Claude de la O later testified that he had personally received more than $100,000 in bribes. He was arrested on January 14, 1996, on a ranch outside the city of Monterrey. The arrest came roughly 6 weeks before the United States government was scheduled to certify Mexico as a partner in the war on drugs, which would unlock American foreign assistance. Critics in both countries have alleged for decades that the Mexican government had known Garcia Abrego's location for years and arrested him only when American certification was on the line. He was deported to the United States within hours. Because of his disputed Texas birth, no extradition hearing was required. His defense team would later allege that he had been forcibly injected with Valium during the transport. His trial in Houston, in front of United States District Judge Ewing Werlein Jr., lasted 4 weeks. The jury deliberated for 12 hours. In October of 1996, they convicted him on all 22 counts, including money laundering, drug trafficking, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. In 1997, Judge Werlein sentenced him to 11 consecutive life sentences, with fines reported at $128 million and a forfeiture of $350 million to the United States government. His attorney, Tony Canales, told the press at the time that the forfeiture was, in his words, a symbolic grab at nothing. Garcia Abrego is still alive. He is 81 years old. He spent nearly 20 years inside the federal Supermax facility, known as ADX Florence in Colorado, before being transferred, around 2016, to a high-security federal penitentiary at Hazleton in Preston County, West Virginia. He is registered with the Bureau of Prisons under the number 09935-000. A retired Bureau of Prisons consultant named Jack Donson once described a transfer out of ADX Florence as the equivalent of dying and going to heaven. Garcia Abrego has never cooperated with American prosecutors. He is, as of the most recent reporting, the longest-serving Mexican cartel boss in the United States federal prison system. Garcia Abrego ran his organization on bribes and corporate logistics. The final subject on this list did something different. He went to war with his oldest ally over a single arrest, and his own death in a Cuernavaca apartment complex would produce one of the most controversial photographs in the history of the Mexican drug war. Arturo Beltrán Leiva. On the night of December 16, 2009, roughly 200 Mexican Navy Marines surrounded a luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca, in the state of Morelos. They had 2 helicopters in the air. They had Mexican Army tanks on the ground in reserve. Inside one of the apartments was a man known to the Mexican government as the boss of bosses, Arturo Beltrán Leiva. The firefight that followed lasted more than 90 minutes. An Associated Press reporter at the scene counted at least 10 separate explosions. The gunman inside threw roughly 20 fragmentation grenades. By the time it was over, Beltrán Leiva was dead, along with several of his bodyguards and a single Mexican Marine. What happened to the Marine's family in the 5 days that followed would become one of the darkest moments in the history of the Mexican drug war. He was born on September 27, 1961, in the municipality of Badiraguato, in the state of Sinaloa. He was born inside the same square of mountain villages that produced El Chapo Guzman and El Mayo Zambada. He used several aliases over his career, including El Barbas, meaning the beard, El Jefe de Jefes, the boss of bosses, and El Fantasma, the ghost. He was the eldest of 5 brothers, all of them in the trade. Carlos, Alfredo, Mario Alberto, and Hector each played significant roles in the family business. For roughly 2 decades, the Beltrán Leivas operated as the trusted enforcement and logistical wing of the Sinaloa cartel under their cousin and ally, El Chapo Guzman. They served as his underbosses and his security chiefs. When El Chapo was incarcerated in 1993, the brothers helped maintain his operations from the outside. They moved cash to him in prison. They are widely understood to have helped arrange his escape from Puente Grande in January of 2001. In 2002, in a series of meetings, the Beltrán Leiva organization, the Sinaloa cartel, and several smaller affiliates formalized themselves into what they called the Federation, sometimes also called the Alianza de Sangre, the Blood Alliance. Under Arturo's command, the Beltrán Leiva organization, often shortened to BLO, ran cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamine into 11 Mexican states and Mexico City. The DEA estimated the cartel's monthly cocaine flow at 300 to 400 kilograms. The BLO's internal enforcement unit was called the Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo, the Special Forces of Arturo, which carried out numerous assassinations of Mexican police and federal officials. The cartel's bribery network reached into Mexico's judiciary, political class, and law enforcement. At one point, investigators determined that the BLO had successfully bribed Noé Ramirez Mandujano, the man serving at the time as the federal drug czar of Mexico. Then, in 2008, the alliance with El Chapo collapsed. On January 21st of that year, the Mexican military arrested Arturo's brother Alfredo, nicknamed El Mochomo, meaning desert ant. Several months later, El Chapo's son Ivan Archivaldo was released from custody on what the federal government described as a technicality. Arturo concluded that El Chapo had traded his brother to authorities in order to secure his son's release. He declared war on the Sinaloa cartel. The Beltran Leyvas retaliated in May of 2008 by assassinating El Chapo's 22-year-old son, Edgar Guzman Lopez, outside a Culiacan shopping center. The BLO then allied with Los Zetas and with Vicente Carrillo's Juarez cartel against Sinaloa. In further retaliation for Alfredo's arrest, Arturo ordered the assassination of Edgar Eusebio Millán Gómez, the federal police commissioner of Mexico. By 2009, United States and Mexican intelligence had been tracking Arturo for months. On December 11th of that year, Mexican Navy Marines raided a lavish Christmas party Arturo had thrown in Cuernavaca, at which the norteño musicians Ramón Ayala and Los Cadetes de Linares had performed. Arturo escaped. 5 days later, on December 16th, the Marines tried again. Roughly 200 troops moved on a single apartment complex. 2 helicopters dropped Marines onto the building. Mexican Army tanks were staged outside. The firefight lasted more than 90 minutes. Residents told reporters they heard at least 10 separate explosions over the course of the operation. Several Beltran Leyva gunmen died alongside their leader. One, cornered, took his own life. A single Mexican Marine, Melchizedek Angulo Cordova, was killed in the assault. The photographs that emerged from inside the apartment afterward became one of the most controversial images of the entire Mexican drug war. Arturo's body was photographed face up on the floor, his pants pulled down, his shirt lifted, and his torso covered in a layer of $100 bills and Mexican peso notes. The Interior Secretary of Mexico, Fernando Gómez Montt, publicly described the photographs as unnecessarily offensive to the family. A medical examiner and 3 of his employees were suspended pending an internal inquiry into whether the body had been deliberately tampered with at the scene. And somehow, it gets worse. The Marine killed in the operation, Melchizedek Angulo Cordova, was buried with full military honors on December 21st. Hours after the funeral, an armed group reportedly used a sledgehammer to break down the front door of the Angulo family home. According to National Public Radio's coverage from December 22, 2009, the gunmen sprayed the family with bullets. Angulo's mother, his brother, his sister, and an aunt were all killed in the attack. They had buried their son and brother that morning. Arturo Beltran Leyva's death was later confirmed by DNA testing, using a comparison sample taken from his imprisoned brother, Alfredo. The Beltran Leyva organization fragmented into a series of violent splinter groups, including Los Mazatlecos, Guerreros Unidos, and Los Rojos. His brother Alfredo was eventually extradited to the United States and sentenced, in April of 2017, to life in prison, with a forfeiture order of $529 million. His brother Hector was arrested in 2014. 8 men, 8 cartels, and the founding generation of the modern Mexican drug trade. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.